afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this side event, official side event, hosted by Fair Climate Fund, Fairtrade International, and Women Organizing for Change in Agriculture and Natural Resource Management. For the next hour and 15 minutes or so, we'll be talking on voluntary carbon markets, and especially how to get them right, how to make them fair, and how to make them in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. So my name is Helene de Koning. I'm a professor of climate policy at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands, and I'll be moderating this discussion today. And we'll have a very simple program. We'll have 3 short presentations with very limited amounts of slides by the 3 people joined me here on the stage. And after that, we'll have a panel discussion and a Q&A also with all of you, and also potentially virtually if you're joining from elsewhere. So I'll invite the first speaker to start. His name is Marcel Spaas. He works with Fair Climate Fund. He's a manager of nature-based solutions there, and he will give an introduction to the work of Fair Climate Fund and how to get these voluntary carbon markets right.
Yep. For me to start?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Well, I thought you introduced everyone. Thank you, Elaine, and it's an honor to be here at the COP26 and contributing to this discussion. At Fair Climate Fund, we call upon the fair race to net zero to achieve structural impact in the global south. Making sure that the transition to a net zero carbon economy does not overlook the people who are most vulnerable to climate change. The voluntary carbon market can contribute to this transition in developing countries. However, right now we see it's not transparent, it is not fair, and it's certainly not inclusive. That worries us. Often carbon finance does not really reach small-scale farmers and low-income households that are actually responsible for the emission reductions. For example, women in Burkina Faso cooking on improved cook stoves, which they construct themselves. A family in India who decides to embrace biogas as a cooking solution. Farmers in Peru who do collectively planting trees in their communal land to support them and to give themselves a better future. A refugee family in Chad who uses solar cooking to reach their scarce available firewood. If those people do that, if they are the ones who reduce the carbon emissions, wouldn't it be fair to have a benefit from this? Would it be fair that the carbon markets support those people in their reduction and their transition? The Fairtrade Climate Standard is supporting this and will be addressed by Juan Pablo later on. But I'd like to take you a little bit and give you more insights what is at stake and focus on how companies can really make impact. Obviously, industrialized countries are responsible for the majority of CO2 emission. The richest 10% of the people cause more than half of the global CO2 emissions. However, the greatest impact of climate change occurs in developing countries. Changing weather patterns, floods, extreme droughts are a major challenge for countries that are largely dependent on small-scale agriculture. In addition, these countries lack the financial means for transition and necessary adaptation. In our view, in our experience, the carbon market can be instrumental in getting the necessary carbon finance for the private sector, from the private sector to support the transition to a zero carbon economy in developing countries. But only as long as it's organized in a transparent, fair and inclusive way, and linked to audacious goals of corporates to reduce their own emissions first. Actually leaving no space for greenwashing with cheap credits, and no more space for false climate neutral claims, no more space for blah blah blah, and distraction of what is needed, like Greenpeace is calling for. Real ambitious corporate climate action is based on 2 pillars. One is ambitious and science-based corporate emission reduction targets and transparent reporting on the adherence to those targets. Second one, corporate climate finance for high-impact projects and initiatives that support energy transition and climate adaptation in developing countries, and that are most developing countries and they are more vulnerable to climate change while guaranteeing full exercise of human rights. That linkage often missing. Furthermore, in order to make ambitious climate plans, it's essential for the private sector to have clear legislation. So there's also a task. And for an effective voluntary carbon market, an independent supervising authority is needed. With this in mind, we are trying to shift companies away from superficial neutrality thinking towards having an ambitious corporate climate strategy that focuses on making long-term positive impact. A great framework that I want to address here is the Blueprint for Corporate Climate Action by WWF. It's a really practical framework which resonates more and more with our clients. In short, it says companies should align with science-based targets and set a price on the remaining emissions to create a budget beyond net zero, which they can invest in highly quality and impactful climate projects. The great thing about this approach for project developers is that once a company is letting go the neutral claim, they are able to look beyond. The conversation can go about how to create real impact. That will often allow for including high-quality carbon projects in the company's portfolio that really contribute to sustainable development. To summarize this, and that is what we call the fair race to net zero, is that the road to zero emissions should mainly come from companies' own efforts to reduce. That's absolutely the basics. Next to that, the company's climate finance strategy should not be focused on climate neutral or net zero claims, but should be focused on supporting the transition, adaptation, and creating positive impact. That's why we have been working with the Fairtrade Climate Standard since 2017. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting and succinct. I have one follow-up question maybe to you, because you work as Fair Climate Fund with these corporate clients, right? So you help them with their compensation, they help your project. You also demand basically from them, in order for them to be a partner of Fair Climate Fund, they need to do their own mitigation as well. So how do you determine when is it enough, and what is your practical experience with working with them on that?
To be honest, the whole development of the Science-Based Targets initiative is really a good handhold for looking at indeed the ambition of a corporate organization. And it is the dialogue you start with. Yeah? It is seeing for what information do they already have, how far are they. Is it only a CSR manager who's doing the talk, or is the company involved in the carbon calculations? And from the carbon calculations for the carbon footprint, we focus on the reduction strategy. Yeah? And that is first indeed their own company, inside the company, and the residual carbon emissions. Yeah? That is why our projects coincide.
Right. And have you ever rejected clients?
Recently we rejected one. And that had more to do with, it's a big polluter which wanted to greenwash in a way, that we say, okay, this far.
Yeah, thanks, very interesting. Okay, we'll straight away move on to the next presentation. Juan Pablo, let me look up what I wrote down on your background. Juan Pablo Solis works with Fairtrade International, where he's a senior advisor, climate and environment. He's Costa Rican by background and has worked in agricultural development and climate issues for more than 15 years. He's worked basically all over the world, and he's also the contact point for the Fairtrade Climate Standard. So we really look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. And thank you, Martin and Jeannette. Also, very pleased to be here with you all. I think I have one slide just or two, just an introduction. And yeah, I'm Juan Pablo, and I'm taking care of climate within the Fairtrade system. Fairtrade has been known mostly for its social achievements, but and one thing that is important for me to say is that I started this position this year in the middle of the pandemic, which is weird, but has been an amazing year so far. So yeah, Fairtrade has been known mostly for these social achievements, social approaches. But one of the things that I've been seeing this year is that there's so much richness in the environmental and climate angle. Fairtrade, yes, is a voluntary standard, mostly also known in agriculture commodities, coffee, cocoa, bananas. But it's also a movement. The Fairtrade movement is built on partnerships between consumers, producers, traders, and that's part of the philosophy. Within Fairtrade, our approach is, well, setting standards, but also calculate minimum prices that serves as a sort of a safety net to protect producers in the market. Sometimes these minimum prices are associated with premiums that empower also the communities to redistribute benefits towards development in those communities. We also work together with our partners, our commercial partners, in developing what we call offer to business, implementing different climate initiatives, doing advocacy work with the producer networks. So yeah, it's a little bit of everything, but summarizing and coming back to the standards, in 2013, with the support of Dutch organizations like ICCO and others, Fairtrade started to develop the climate standard because at that time, Fairtrade saw an opportunity to add fairness in the carbon market as well. The standard was launched in the COP21 in Paris, almost 5 years ago. Next one, please. And just to explain how it works, the idea is that when you have a project, then you review your emissions using the Clean Development Mechanism tools, and then you issue that. We have an agreement with the gold standard. At that time, the gold standard was very recognized, and it still is, and I will explain why also we have this alignment with the gold standard. But then when the project is developed, the emission reduction is verified, the social and environmental integrity is considered within the gold standard framework, the project is issued by gold standard, and then they can apply to Fairtrade. It's kind of an add-on on top of the certification. And this add-on ensures fairness in trading these carbon credits. What do we mean with fairness? It's basically 6 things. We oversee democracy and transparency, the empowerment of the decisions and the empowerment of the communities, following also the principles of fair trade. The second is the minimum price that I was referring to. We have calculations on the different methodologies, and these calculations are based on the cost of the technology, the cost of certification, and the return to the producers of these carbon credits. Then the possibility to reinvest premiums in adaptation. Fair trade carbon credits have the possibility to add not only the minimum price, but a fair trade premium to be reinvested in adaptation. This also goes hand in hand with capacity building, so producers of these carbon credits can also develop climate adaptation plans or increase their resilience in general. And then two elements that are very core in our approach is human rights and environmental rights due diligence, the question that you were raising about companies. And then the sixth element is that end buyers, those that commit to source more than 1,000 tons of CO2 equivalents, they need to come to an agreement with our national fair trade organizations and come with a reduction plan. Our philosophy is you reduce first and you compensate second. So this is more or less how the system works. As I mentioned, it was launched in 2015. 6 years more or less have passed. So this year I've been investing quite a lot of time in understanding what is the status, the state of the art of the instrument at the moment. We have projects in India, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Lesotho, Peru. I have to remember, I think Ghana has another one. So I've been collecting information from all these projects with a research team to understand what is the challenges and what is also the connections with the Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of challenges, there are 5 that I've been noticing quite relevant. The first one is the challenge of empowering the communities, make them the owners of the process. This is still a challenge. Next to that is how these communities can understand the projects, because when we talk about carbon credits, the concept is very abstract. It's not something that you can touch or you can see. You know? It's based on a report and an estimation. So that abstract component of the carbon credit per se is a challenge, how communities can understand that. Then a third element is the prices. We have seen that not all commercial partners are keen to invest and pay the minimum price that guarantees a return. Some companies, of course, are doing that, but some other companies argue that there in the market other carbon credits with lower prices, and what should they pay these premiums, etc. And the fifth element is that most of the communities are on a very heavy climate crisis. No? So the need for mitigation is important, but also the need for adaptation is maybe more important, which connects with the distribution of benefits, economic benefits in general. No? Guarantee a proper income for these producers of carbon credits. I would like to stop here because I think that for the conversation it would be interesting for me to continue later. But in a nutshell, this is how it works, and this is a bit of what we have been working so far in the climate standard. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, indeed.
Thanks.
So, as a question, I was wondering, how do you determine what is a fair price? I mean, I can imagine that with chocolate or with coffee, it's a different challenge than with carbon credits.
Yeah, well, I should have asked my price colleagues to be here to explain more the details, but in general, we take the cost, the general condition in all the minimum price that Fairtrade set is based on the sustainable cost of production. So we see what, in the case of carbon credits, what is the cost of the technology. I mentioned that we have this agreement with gold standard, so we follow 3 protocols of gold standard, the one for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and reforestation, afforestation. So for instance, in case of renewable energy projects, if it's a project about cook stoves, then the cost of adopting those cook stoves and install those cook stoves in the household. And then the cost of the cost of the certification, sorry, and then what we say the premium and the return over the investment. What is going to be in the pocket of the producer at the end? For renewable energy projects, the estimation is that 1 ton of CO2 emission needs to have a minimum price of 8.2 euros per ton. For energy efficiency is 8.5, and for renewable reforestation, afforestation is 13 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. I might be mistaking some numbers, but that's more or less the generic.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Then we'll move on to Jeannette Gurung from Women. Wolcon, yes, that's right. I already said the full name earlier. Yeah, please explain to us what you're. That's what I just. Okay, yeah, sure. I'll introduce you a little bit more. So, Jeannette, we're really glad to have her here and to work together on this event. So, Wolcon is. I didn't know it, I have to admit, but it's a very large network with over 1,400 members in 114 countries, with the aim of supporting capacity building for women's leadership and empowerment. And also gender integration. And also Wolcon has developed a standard, the W+ standard, which I already heard here in the corridors that it was actually used by several organizations to measure, quantify and monetize impacts of projects and supply chains on women's empowerments. So Jeannette has a master and a PhD in gender and development. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's truly my great honor to be here with these other organizations who I think of the carbon markets and in the same way that Wolcon does. And so I think there are not many of us perhaps in the world yet who see the potential that carbon markets may have to bring about social goods. So it's been wonderful to even do the preparation with this team to share common ideas. Wolcon, besides running this network of people, and what's unique about Wolcon is that all Wolcon members it's about 90% women, about 10% men, but all of us have backgrounds in agriculture, forestry, land use related sectors that now we can understand as climate sectors, and expertise in gender or a strong interest and commitment to gender equality. So one of the types of activities that Wolcon is often involved in are relevant to climate is often we train and guide organizations in how to become gender responsive. We're trainers, we're researchers, and we have been doing this for a very long time. We're 17 years old. This is what we've always done. We've written gender action plans, for example, for the Green Climate Fund, for some of the World Bank's climate funds, etc. Before I get to what is W+ standard, I'll just tell you why we created it in about the same time that the Fairtrade standard was being created in maybe 2015, 2016. It was really out of a sense of frustration and necessity. So here we were doing gender mainstreaming training and coming to understand that there needs to be a system of accountability and not measuring progress by incomes and outputs, but rather by outcomes and results and impacts. And that was really an aha moment. And I have to say that was inspired by learning about carbon markets that do something similar. The second reason we did it was to incentivize projects to bring about more benefits for women. Again, we had a long history of trying to train these organizations, but in the end we found, as I like to say, there was not a big enough carrot nor a big enough stick to induce these kind of, may I say, male-dominated institutions in these sectors of forestry, agriculture, water resources, etc. We needed to find a way, and we thought we could use a market-based approach that would bring about real financial benefits to those organizations that, in fact, did develop gender-responsive methodologies and brought women's benefits to women and included women in benefit sharing. The third reason was really that's closest to Wolcon's heart and closest to Wolcon's mission, which is to drive new financial resources and support to women's groups, women's organizations. This is based on the evidence we've seen over the years of the tremendous impact, I would say untapped potential, of women's groups to deliver outcomes related to forest management, water management, agriculture management, etc., with, I would say, no recognition, certainly no support. So we thought, is there a way we could use a carbon market ecosystem to drive new benefits to these women's groups? And I just want to add here that the research that comes out shows that the amount of overseas development assistance money that is targeted and reaching women's organizations and women's groups is 0.1 or maybe 0.2% of all ODA. I find that shocking. I'll say it here. I think it's criminal. And so somebody has got to do something about it. And we just thought maybe we could do this. So Yeah, the next slide, if you could. The one on, yes. So here you can see what this is, what the W plus standard, and I really do hope that you'll go to the website because there's a lot more there, but this was what it is. It's the certification framework. And I need to say here, although we're talking a lot about it in relation to carbon markets, it is agnostic. It is a standalone standard certification system. It's been used, for example, to measure women's education and knowledge around financial literacy in Vietnam with a bank. It does not need to be attached to a climate standard, but we see enormous potential in that in doing so. So you can see as well, we can see that it could be like a fair trade kind of a label where it could be used as a consumer-facing label to indicate to somebody that when you purchase this product, you pay a premium, and the benefits are also related to women's empowerment. So it really, for the climate value, as I say here, it can be done as a standalone standard and stacked onto another carbon standard or any other standard. But we also have, in the same way that Juan mentioned, their relationship to gold standard, the W plus standard also has a relationship with Verra, which is a very large carbon standard that allows users to use it as a label on top of a voluntary carbon unit as measured by Verra. So that, again, is something that generates a higher price on top of a carbon credit that has this co-benefit for women's empowerment. So I want to say just a minute here about how we develop that, because I think it's fundamental to understanding its social nature. We started out by talking to women in 2 countries, in rural Kenya and rural Nepal, and said, what does women's empowerment mean to you? And to my amazement, both groups came up with these 6 areas that you see in the wheel, which we call the domains. And I think a really important one was time, and many women said time is the most important aspect of what it means to become empowered, but these other aspects were as well. So what Wolcon did was take each of these 6 areas and use qualitative and quantitative data to develop the indicators and the methodology to measure in each of those. So the requirement is that a project needs to use at least 1. It could use all 6 if they choose. But so this gives the standard the flexibility to be used to a number of different kinds of projects with different goals. Otherwise, the process is the same. As I said, we were inspired by carbon standards with the rigor and the transparency of the system. So we developed the standard in a way that would use the same process. So the process is, again, consultation with the communities. Also, we put in gender analysis, so the project has to do a gender analysis in the first stage, and that confirms which of these domains are most relevant to the women's group in the area. Then we prepare the indicators, the questionnaires. Then there's a baseline, and at some later time when the project determines they have impacts, they use the same questions to develop what the results have been. It then receives a verification by an independent body, not a bunch of carbon verifiers. These are social audit experts who determine what is a W plus credit. So W plus credit is the percent of change from baseline to results, right? So the idea here is to monetize these credits. So they are sold. You're going to ask me if you have a chance, who buys them? We're still building that market, obviously. Sometimes it's corporates, sometimes it's development funds and foundations, and et cetera. But here's the key point, which is the last point, which is at least 20% of the value, the market value of that W plus credit must be given in a grant form to women's groups, women's organizations within the community in which that project was managed. No one tells those women what to do with that money. This is women's empowerment. We're supporting women's agency. They have pretty good ideas of what they need and what their communities are. And so it's been interesting to see how they use it. In some cases, it is for climate adaptation, I would say. In others, maybe not. But that's the model. We think this is a solution. It's a solution to achieving women's empowerment at the same time of also being able to achieve some kind of climate outcomes. And it's, I think as well, we need to think about how it can be linked to SDGs. We are learning more and more about how SDGs are also driving investment and driving impact measurement. So the W+ has been accepted as the methodology to measure SDG 5 under Vera's SD Vista, for example. That's kind of a no-brainer, I think, for us. But for us, it's, again, the way to prevent, you hear greenwashing? Well, we've also got pinkwashing, right? Where companies might make claims about what great things they're doing for women's empowerment. We're not sure. So this is, again, a way to measure that. It's also, I think, for us, a way to bring more attention to the critical role that women play in the management of and the achievement of success within projects related to climate sectors. And again, often under the radar, invisible, as so many things are. So in some way, we can almost see that these payments through this 20% mechanism could also be understood almost as a compensation to women who may be doing things that are providing public goods, public environmental goods for which they are uncompensated. For example, we talk a lot about planting trees, but we know that it's not the planting of trees, it's the survival of the trees. Who takes care of those trees? This is, again, often women's role, women's unpaid roles in this that make or break the success of a project. And I want to say here that some of the examples, some of the projects it's been used for so far in Nepal, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, Morocco, Kenya, to mention some, and one that's coming up is, we've used them for cook stoves, we've used them for renewable energy, for transport, for water resource, and one big one that's coming up that's really noteworthy is for a project developer called Wildlife Works that has been running very large RED projects in Kenya and DRC, for example, that will now be using the W+ standard, and they will be measuring the impact that their attention to women has been around the forestry sector to create jobs and build women's leadership capacities. So I think the other really exciting thing that we've all been talking about here is to put it in the language of business, maybe, but value proposition or the value of this type of approach is that it provides this very unique way to use climate finance and even mitigation finance, such as we find in carbon markets, to fund adaptation. So not relying on specific adaptation funds, but understanding we could designate a certain percent of the value of, for example, a carbon credit, and just stipulate that that must be allocated in a grant form to the communities, within the communities. And it's a way of funding adaptation through mitigation. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. And also, yeah, give her a hand, definitely. So I have a question. So you mentioned one example of an organization applying for the standards. What are generally the kinds of organizations that are applying for that?
The people that understand it best are almost the carbon project developers, or projects that are already engaged in the management and the measurement of carbon, right? So I like to say, here's an example. The project that we won an award for in the early years was, it was a biogas project run by the government of Nepal. And it was basically installing small biogas units at the household level, measuring the carbon, selling the carbon to Nordic countries. And they were not paying attention to the fact that this was having transformational impacts on women's lives, right? Because they were kind of carbon focused. But women engaged in that were telling us that it was saving huge amounts of their time. And that's without even talking about the health and the benefit to forests. And so we used the time measurement here. We measured a time saving of 2.5 hours per day, every single day in a woman's life. And it transformed, in many cases, it transformed their life. It gave them a little breathing space. I kept hoping they would take a nap with that extra time. They didn't, you know. But that kind of thing that then had multiple impacts that were unanticipated. And so we think that there are many projects like that may be already measuring carbon, not paying attention, or could pay attention with a little bit of incentive and could tweak that. So cook stove projects, renewable energy projects are, I think, unnatural for us. But now we're also in the process of measuring transport projects. I mean, when our eyes open to the kinds of impacts that can be held on women, on women's lives, I think we see all kinds of things that we were not aware of in the beginning.
Yeah, thanks. So we've heard now from 3 organizations who are, all in their own ways, are trying to give voluntary carbon markets basically a better reputation. All with a business sense, using standards, being on the ground, and really trying to make things work in practice. So I think that's really nice. I'm just looking at the room to see if there's any questions already from the audience before we go to the panel discussion to any of the speakers. If so, you can move to the microphone and stand there, introduce yourself and ask your question. I don't see anybody rising yet, so I'll just, there's somebody waving there in the back. Yes, you can come up front and join the microphone here and ask a question, please. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for this fantastic panel. My name is Ina Porras. I work for the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And it's really interesting because carbon offsets is coming back again on the agenda. You would have heard the LEAF program that was announced last week. And there is we are not quite merging the jurisdictional with what happens on the ground. As you were saying, it's the people who are going to be planting that tree and looking after that tree and watering it every single day and dealing with the droughts and just making sure that they can have a tree that will stand so that the payment by result would actually be collected. It's really difficult, and Juan Pablo, we worked years ago on trying to understand really the business case of smaller scale community programs, and it was difficult. It was possible. We concluded it was possible, but it was really difficult. So these aggregation, we are talking about tiny, minute amounts of carbon that is collected per unit. So how do you aggregate that? How do you put that together with this break-even price, which is really high? So the break-even price, we were finding it was like 15 euros, sometimes more, and the markets are really far from that. So we may have a few niche markets that are willing to pay a few token carbons for that price, but really at the aggregate level, it's not. So have we moved from that? So what do we know about that? So the other element that's really interesting is that the carbon markets are moving to this payment by results, as I said, this the ex-post element, and yet we know the communities need a lot of ex-ante investment. So what do we have in that time, since 2015 when we did that study, has there been anything that has come up to ensure that these small-scale farmers are able to invest or to have access to resources to do these initial investments so that they can claim payments by results? And finally, on the gender issues, super important. Women will be at the forefront of doing the work and all that, and they are interested, they want to be doing this work as well. So what we have found in some payment for ecosystem services and some other initiatives that are really successful on the gender element is the ones that, for example, will make the cash payment is always better for women, always. And those who get a cash payment is made to the woman of the household. Just make the payment to the woman. It makes such a massive difference to the family. And if they're too small, then let them aggregate for a while and make a payment once every 6 months. In Brazil, the women, they get the money directly to the bank. So for some of them, this is the first time they have a bank account, and they can go and collect the money once every 6 months and use that money to buy school uniforms, medicine, or just to go and have a drink, I don't know. But it's their money. But those are the most successful ones. They just give the money to their women, and yes, it's paternalistic, whatever, but it's very effective. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I heard 2 questions and 1 comment, actually, more. Who wants to take the first question on how do you actually extract value, I guess, from such lots of small reductions in carbon? Do you want to take that, Marcel?
I think so. It's then you talk about the project level. Like for instance, it's not a single household. We work in, for instance, in India, implementing 30,000 cook stoves in a certain region. Our programs are really always linked to a certain volume to make it at least profitable, because there is a business case around it, and carbon finance has to pay back the whole implementation. So it is the number, the greater numbers, which make it possible. And all those small reductions, which is an average 1 to 1.5 ton per family every year, on clean cooking, clean cook stoves. So that's what's added up.
Yeah, thanks. And the second question on sort of the upfront investment, which is sometimes the barrier, is that something you, Juan Pablo, or can I?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ina, for your questions, comments. Ina and I met before working with different studies using, at that time, I remember a couple of years ago also, the idea of agriculture, payment for environmental services in agriculture was something that we wanted to push more, because what you see in the methodologies that are being approved is that, especially connected to small-scale farmers, is that most of these technologies are advocated to energy, like cook stoves, biogas. But as Ina mentioned, smallholder farmers are doing a lot of work in protecting and maintaining greenhouse gases already. And it's sometimes a bit unfair because the methodologies, the additionality of, for instance, soil carbon is very minimum, the amount of carbon that you can add. But the stock of carbon that is in those soils, because of good practices, organic practices, etc., is tremendous. So again, it's a bit unfair sometimes that the methodologies are not so keen to accept, also like incorporate into the calculations the amount of carbon that is already in stock sometimes, no? This is also why we are currently evaluating the methodologies that have been approved in the standard so far. We are keen to look into, for instance, what Plan Vivo is doing, or IUCN with the nature-based solution standard also, because we are trying to understand, or we come to a conclusion more or less that adaptation funds are important and it can be connected to mitigation funds. The whole idea of trading carbon credits should be to empower the communities. My point is very personal, but my point is that the carbon market should be there for upscale innovations, community-based innovations. If we come with a mainstream technology, great, but then there's no carbon market that should do that. I mean, there's other instruments in the climate finance world, or other lending or equities, etc., that can scale those technologies that already reach the mainstream. But the special case of voluntary carbon markets should be there to upscale those community-based innovations. This is my very personal opinion of mine. But I think it's important to start looking how the carbon market can be also an instrument for both mitigation and adaptation, recognizing also all this hard work that has been years smallholders taking the front line on doing those.
Yes. Would you like to come in as well?
Yeah, I don't know which one of those to hit, but thanks, Ina, for that. But, you know, we talk a lot about carbon pricing or pricing of these credits, and if it's sufficiently high and we can get it to cover a lot of the, I mean, for example, we don't have a huge history, market history, pricing history, but, you know, if credits of W plus are €5 on top of the price of a carbon, I mean, that's actually quite interesting. And we also hear from some buyers who are really interested in that 20% back to the community, and some who don't really care about the carbon, but see that this is a mechanism of financial transfer that's rigorous and credible and verifiable, and they like that aspect of it. And so if they're willing to pay for that, I think the aggregation is something we all have to work on. I mean, our dream would be for women's groups themselves to be engaging in project development that would generate both carbon and W plus units. I think we're a long ways away from that, but we do need to look at these ways to aggregate. I don't have the answers for that, but you know, we believe in collective action, and we think as much as possible that we can use this also as a way to invigorate this kind of women's groups. In some communities and countries of the world, it's a little bit problematic when the finance is delivered directly to women. And so there's a social safety net in the women's group, and when it's aggregated in a way through their own collective mechanisms.
Yeah, thanks.
I'd like to just to add a short point is the perspective of the market. And if you look at the voluntary carbon market in the past 9 months, it's more or less exploding. Yeah? So that is really this enormous traction. We had a time ago when the Fairtrade Climate Standard started, then there was we were on the deepest part of the carbon market. Nowadays, it is really increasing. And we see also that a lot of corporates which offset a lot of their footprints in a way we say, look, please don't do that this way because it has no impact. They now see, also because of the negative part of the carbon market, they say, look, we need this credibility. We need this extra input that you are able to link it to the local communities, and have a seal of proof through the Fairtrade Climate Standard. Yeah, that is where they're after. And that is for them, it's also risk avoidance, of course. But we see an increase, and €15 is very doable at the moment in the market.
Yeah.
Helene, if I can just say one thing.
Sure.
On Tuesday here was Gender Day, and we all saw this kind of flurry of financial commitments to gender and climate, which we've never seen anything like that before, right? But from my knowledge is a lot of those donors and funders don't really know how to achieve this, right? So there's a lot of questioning, and you know, my thinking is, if carbon markets are already out there, people are familiar with it, it's kind of a trusted, some way not trusted at all, but can we take that existing thing and tweak it and make it work for us?
Yeah. Thanks. And thanks for that question again, or those questions. I think we're also joined now in the panel by Gert Crielaard, from the fund manager of Fair Climate Fund. Hi Gert, nice to see you. And welcome to this panel discussion. He's basically backing up for Marcel and giving his own perspective in this panel. So maybe I can start with a first question that I would have for all of you, and it's sort of, it was triggered a bit by you, Jeannette, because you have a standard for basically gender, women's rights issues, women empowerment in carbon markets. Now I used to work on the clean development mechanism, decades ago, and we always had these studies looking at the clean development mechanism and how good it was for sustainable development, and you go across, and you try to score it and things like that. So we have a W+ standard now. Do we need a standard for every SDG, right? In the Fair Trade Climate Standards, you say you cover 5 SDGs or so. Is this going to be, are we going to require like a whole list of standards and labels in order to make sure that these projects are in line with the SDGs? So I'd like to hear your views on this, because I'm a little bit afraid that we're building this enormous bureaucracy on something that you'd like the market to handle. Do you want to start? Or
I think Juan can speak to
Yeah,
that.
well, I mentioned that this year I've been investing time in understanding what is the state of the art of the Fairtrade climate standard. One of the elements that, for instance, being in partnership with Gold Standard bring to us is the SDG framework. We have been evaluating the impact of the different projects looking at the SDGs. So, for instance, in general, I can mention 5 that make that connection. SDG 5, gender equity. I think Jeanette has already put the elements in the table, but it's the evidence of women involvement in decision-making processes. This is an element that we are observing also in India. I have very tremendous narratives of women empowerment in those projects there. Then SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, that relates to the different condition, the decent condition of working. In our standard, there's 5 chapters: the general conditions, the social and economic conditions, the environmental conditions, and the labor conditions, because we also want to ensure that there's human rights protection for workers, and if involved in the process. For instance, those workers that are building the biogas installations, they need to also be covered. No? And then the other element that, the other SDG that we are seeing is SDG 10, reduction of inequalities. This is all about the fairness and the redistribution of wealth, ensuring equitable sharing in the trade relation. Then SDG 12, responsible consumption production. In our projects, the idea also, it's not always the case, but the idea is that smallholder producers that are organized, that are producing bananas, cocoa, coffee, or other commodity that also is regulated on the fair trade terms, can offer to the market carbon credits. So it's producing goods, producing agriculture commodities, but also producing carbon credits. So it's how to stimulate also sustainable production consumption. And finally, SDG 13, climate action, because at the end, we all need to do our piece to ensure that more actions are taking care of our climate crisis.
And why did you focus on those SDGs and not add on others?
Well, this is what we are seeing at the moment. This is, for instance, we can see, or we can evaluate the impact on poverty, the impact on hunger, but at least from the preliminary impact study, these 5 are the ones that are more related or giving us more information about.
Thanks. Would you like to comment on this, mate? Gert, do you have any views on this question on which SDGs we should cover and how that can be measured?
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. Maybe to respond first to the question of the additional costs that are added to projects with each certification. I think that is something that is something to be critical on, the certification costs of projects. However, I think this has largely to do also with project scale. This perhaps also relates to the question from the audience. I mean, when you do proper project development with sufficient scale, the cost of certification doesn't need to be that high. I mean, I know examples that, certification costs are around 1% of the total project cost. I mean, maybe with small scale projects, it can be done for less than 10% of total project costs. So there are ways in, setting up the project to reduce the certification cost. And I also think that, the potential for scale is huge, right? I mean, if we only look at clean cooking, it's 2% of emissions worldwide. And that's the conservative estimate. That's equal to the emissions of international aviation, just to get it in the right perspective. We have another project in India that is focused on crop residue burning. Crop residue burning is responsible for 3.5% of global emissions. I mean, the potential for these type of projects in terms of emission reductions is huge. And I think when you have a proper setup that is replicable, then, you know, the cost of certification is very much manageable. It has a lot to do with scale. But of course, for reaching scale, you need to have a proper design, work with good partners. I mean, also, you know, not develop a lot of small-scale different projects where you work with different partners. Try to work with scalable models with the same partners, of which you know that are reliable and can reach scale. I think that is very important in, let's say, first of all, the project design and execution of the project.
Thanks. Can I ask a follow-up question on how you do that? How do you, because I can imagine it is a lot of work to monitor all these very small-scale projects. So how do you keep the costs low? Do you use IT? Do you use satellites? Do you use representative samples? What can you say a little bit more about the details of that?
Yeah. It depends a bit on the methodology that is chosen. But representative samples, that is something that is quite normal to work with in gold standard projects. I mean, there's a lot of new technical development also with regard to reforestation projects. There's more like satellite data is being used more. With clean cooking projects, it is sensor-based monitoring that is really coming up and becoming more affordable. So there's a lot of ways to keep these costs down, and I think you have to be inventive about it. Look, as a project developer, look at what the new technologies are and to see how can we smartly use those new technologies to keep down the cost of certification, but also to improve the monitoring, I would say. I think that might be even a bigger added value of these new technologies, that you get more data, monitoring based on proper data. So I think that is something we will see in the coming years to really take up in carbon projects.
And how much on top of the gold standard requirements does the fair trade standard add in terms of additional monitoring and additional cost potentially? I don't know if you want to take that or Gert.
Yeah, well, maybe I can add some things, and then Marcel, you can also complement me. As I mentioned before, we try to see the governance structure, and this is important to oversee, for instance, that decisions have been taken care of democracy and transparency across, no? So empowering that decisions are legitimate. And then the other aspect that we see is the proper due diligence, human rights and environmental rights processes, especially with the environment. The whole issue about reducing first, that is something that the auditors are often overseeing. You mentioned before, and maybe I can do that as a small brief on the cost, the structure of cost. I actually have it here, I forgot about it. But it's the cost of the pre-investment plus the cost of the project plus the carbon cost. So when we are talking about that, is everything from the transportation, the computers, the training, the monitoring, but the certification, the registration, the validation and verification, which is a very heavy cost as well. No? Not without saying that, for instance, the methodologies per se are costly, and the maintenance of that methodologies over time. For instance, if you have a reforestation project, you have to plant a tree, and you have to nourish the tree and allow the tree to grow. But what type of tree, for instance? What trees are more suitable for the conditions of different contexts? So it's very detailed. It's not just, as Ina was mentioning in her comment, it's not just planting trees and that's it. It's which trees are suitable for your land to increase your resilience. Which trees are in danger of get lost, so we can add biodiversity elements into that. It's just trees for timber, or it's trees for food security. These elements are important and are the ones that we are trying to look again next to the certification of gold standard.
Okay, thanks. And I'm looking at the room. If there's questions, please move up to the mic and I will give you the floor. But if I don't see anybody rising, I'll just, oh yeah, go ahead. Come up, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Hi, Dave Rouse from New Zealand. I run a business called Carbon Click in the voluntary market and share the same passions that you're talking about now. What I'm wondering is whether you have any way of quantifying the social impact or pricing the social impact. For example, one example with the cook stove projects that you mentioned in Fiji, an area that I went to that had these improved cook stoves. Yes, it's great for reducing particulates in the house because it's much cleaner burning, but what they don't, they're fueled by coconut husks mainly, but what they're not burning in the house, they're burning outside. So it's a bit of a false economy when it came to the carbon thing, whereas some areas around the world, they have to go and harvest the wood or chop the wood down, dry it, and then cook with it, so you get a much better per dollar spend impact on the environment. Have you got any measure of that you're putting into this system to actually quantify those so that we know where is the best place to be able to invest with the best results over and above carbon?
Thanks.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I can start and then if Jeannette wants to complement. As I mentioned, our standard has 5 chapters. One of them is the social characteristics. So it's the same principles in other fair trade standard. We measure, for instance, issues like child labor, that this is not happening. We measure social compliance in general. It's difficult to sometimes measure quantitative data in social terms. Is more often the case that qualitative data is more what we get, no? The evidence, the changing conditions in the household. These are the things that it's difficult to put a number, no? But the stories are very strong. You're from New Zealand. Our office in Australia, New Zealand is working at this moment in Papua New Guinea, and they started to look at how the communities get organized. So that is the very first thing, building trust in the community, building community per se. I mentioned it, no? It's all about community-based innovations. So this project in Papua New Guinea is quite exciting because what my colleagues are doing there is working together with the community, allowing that decisions are being taken in a proper governance. Those are elements that are difficult to put a number on it.
Yeah, I can add something. I mean, for us, we're just looking at women's empowerment and gender equality. But, you know, when women identified leadership as one of, and I think maybe that's the one of those 6 domains that may be fundamental to women's empowerment is leadership, right? How do you quantify? So my team set about that goal of quantifying leadership. I mean, you can quantify anything, quite frankly, right? So you have a mix of qualitative data and you assign relatives on a scale basis. Because if we're going to monetize it, we have to quantify it, right? So it may not be perfect, and somebody could argue with it, but we've made those forays into things, also things like food security, which may not be a social impact, but Traditionally it's measured by number of months of food insecurity, but for us it had so many more consequences and things to measure than just literally how much food there is. It was also associated with the stress that women would have to go through to secure the food. I didn't think necessarily that food security was an area of women's empowerment until women in Kenya said, if we can't put food on the table, we're beaten. Okay, that for me was enough to convince me and we can be open to more gender-based violence components. We've currently got it under the health section, but it could be its own domain. We can develop its own methodology. So it's interesting, we work with social auditors, right, who we find are actually prevalent in the UK as the only country I have found so far, and there may be others, who know how to do auditing for social outcomes without going in depth and doing impact assessments, but know what to look for. But it gets tricky sometimes. So time saving that I mentioned from biogas could be seen as something pretty easy. However, what we realized when we were talking to these women in Nepal, there's almost a leakage. There's the potential of leakage problem, right? They save time here, and it gets allocated. It's like, okay, now you don't have to do the cooking, but now you have to clean the toilets or something, right? So it's potentially not leisure time, it's just moved into something else that's potentially worse. So our standard also looks for those outcomes as well. It's kind of a do no harm type of thing.
Thanks. Does that answer your question? Very nice that you came up and introduced yourself.
It's a very tough one.
I'm looking around, I don't see anybody else coming up. So I have another question. I mean, we're all very concerned with the reputation of carbon markets, right? Which is, let's say, a bit questionable to some, right? It's, there's a lot of bad credits out there. You're all engaged in, and many more here, engaged in sort of improving that reputation. I mean, besides better standards and the types of projects that you're all involved in, what else do you think would help improving that reputation so that it can actually play that role that we all were hoping, especially CDM type of projects would play? I would like to start on that.
Yeah, I think a key issue is additionality of your program. The project itself should be financed through carbon as being fully additional. We see in the carbon market at this moment that projects which are financed by third parties or even families who buy cook stoves, they don't get the benefits from the carbon. And that means that at the end, the polluter gets a subsidized carbon credit, well, actually on the back of somebody from Uganda who buys a cook stove. Well, that is a strange thing which is happening. So if you make transparent for how the whole financial stream is developed, who is gaining what benefit, and what players are there in the market, then you at least give the full, you give the full scope for how the credit benefits locally. And I think that's a real important thing to the transparency in the market.
But I mean, we had additionality requirements in the CDM. And there was a whole mechanism, trying to check it with a board and et cetera, et cetera.
True, and somewhere there's still what is a stew here, and there's really a lot of credit still, like the Turkish wind discussion. Wind parks which are developed where not on top of that carbon credits are developed, which had nothing to do with the business case of the windmill park, but they were allowed to enter the market at that time, and they're still abundant available. Meaning it's really a threat of the quality and the reduction potential of which our market has.
If I can just add a couple of lines there. Most of the critiques that I have heard related to carbon markets is about the same community saying you are profiting with my land, you are profiting with my resources, you are profiting with my Pachamama. I think if we want to really avoid greenwashing, we need to empower these producers, these communities. This is the very first thing. How to ensure that there's a proper case for them, a proper return over the investment for these communities. Because at the end, it's a nice project. It's generating carbon credits for companies that are polluting. But that is a fair element there. These companies are polluting and they're paying, so that payment should be there to empower the communities and empower these producers of the carbon credits. And that is the very first thing that we have to do, and we have to assure that this is the driver behind carbon markets.
Yeah. Thanks. And Gert, if you want to come in, do raise your voice. I don't know, Jeanette, do you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot also has to do with how carbon credits are being used by, let's say, what we call end users, but which are the companies that are compensating for their CO2. I mean, what Marcel was explaining in the beginning, we sort of want to decouple this this netting out, right? I am emitting here and I'm doing projects there with the same amount, and then I'm climate neutral or carbon neutral or whatever. I mean, if you're emitting carbon, you're never neutral. So what we propose is the decoupling of those two, so that companies have their own reduction strategy that is focused on getting to zero emissions. That's, one pillar strategy. The other strategy, the other pillar is about the climate finance strategy. And that is about pricing your remaining emissions, creating a budget for climate finance and investing that in adaptation and mitigation in the places where it is most needed. I think that is where climate finance should be focused on financing the transition and adaptation. And it should not be focused on being able to claim climate neutrality. I think if we let go of this desperate need, wanting to claim climate neutrality through offsets, I think then there's more space for high quality projects and also in the end a higher credibility of the voluntary carbon market.
Okay, thanks. So we have about 2 minutes left, so that is 30 seconds per panel member. So I have a question to you, and please answer it in 30 seconds only. The question is, what lesson do you have for the Article 6 discussions? Juan Pablo, can I start with you?
Yeah, well, that's a good one. I will say that, well, I think Marcel already mentioned a few, but for me, there are 3 elements that are fundamental to be sure of. Transparency and assurance, avoid greenwashing, and equitable sharing. These 3 needs to be there always, whatever type of projects you are trying to develop. So in order to move ahead with Article 6, we need to have these 3 elements proper addressed. New regulations are going to happen. Probably I've heard about carbon taxes. There's a lot of discussion about that. We think that this is an opportunity for more organizations to start looking at carbon markets, but again, from a transparency point of view, avoiding the greenwashing and enable equitable sharing.
Thank you. Marcel, very quickly.
I fully agree. Not for Article 6, but for the companies who are working on climate mitigation, take climate more serious than the CSR officer. Yeah? So it really, everybody says it's already in the boardroom, yeah, but we don't see it back in the whole structure in the companies. And that's where I think key issue to address this.
Thanks. Jeanette?
I'm not that familiar with the details of Article 6, but benefit sharing, co-benefits, high quality, and adaptation, and how this can transition to adaptation mechanism.
Thanks. And Gert, finally?
Yes, a focus on adaptation and making the transition happening in the countries where it is so desperately needed.
Thanks.
I stop there.
Yes, with 14 seconds left on the clock. I'd like to thank you all for your great contributions to this panel discussion and your presentations, and of course for your great work to making this world a better place and preventing climate change. Thank you for listening, for staying on, and for asking questions. And with that, I'd like to close this side event and wish you a great evening.